Today we are facing some of the greatest challenges of our lives, from our health to political unrest, the environment, financial uncertainty, and the nation's racial divide. Welcome to Bill Myers Inspires. My idea for this show was to invite guests and get the conversation started, to take a deep dive into the issues that impact our world with an eye to exploring solutions. And we encourage our listeners to look within themselves to take decisive action to make a positive difference. Welcome, welcome, welcome to Bill Myers Inspires. I'm your host, Bill Myers, and I am so excited today. We are continuing our discussion on race, and we're doing a deep dive. Last week, we had the privilege of having Dixon D. White with us, who offered some pretty good information, and we are going to follow up with equally good information this week. I would like to start today's program with a quote from the great author James Baldwin. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. Today we are inviting to the microphone a good friend of mine. He is an author who has written a book that we are going to discuss today entitled Inheriting the Trade. Our discussion will cover slavery and racism with, again, the acclaimed author Thomas Norman DeWolf. Imagine, if you would, to discover that you were a descendant of the largest slave trading family in United States history. How would you use that information to discuss slavery and racism? Why is it necessary to address slavery and racism for America to move forward? Thomas Norman DeWolf is an author, public speaker, trainer, and workshop facilitator, and since 2003 has served as director and manager for Coming to the Table. He travels extensively throughout the United States, speaking and leading workshops and trainings at colleges, universities, conferences, and other venues. He exposes hidden elements of history and shows how traumatic, unhealed wounds from the past continue to impact everyone today. Such wounds are expressed on campuses and elsewhere as racism, sexism, and other forms of intolerance, separation, and hierarchies of human value. With compassion and humor, Tom illuminates a path toward healing and a more hopeful future. Tom is the author of Inheriting the Trade, which was published by Beacon Press in 2008, I believe. The story of his experiences in the making of an Emmy-nominated PBS documentary, Traces of the Trade, and co-author with Sharon Leslie Morgan of Gather at the Table, which was published by Beacon Press in 2012, which won the Phyllis Wheatley Award for Best Nonfiction Biography and Memoir in 2013. The African American Jazz Caucus awarded Tom the 2012 Spirit of Freedom Award for Social Justice. Tom is also a co-author with Jody Geddes of The Little Book of Racial Healing, published by Skyhorse in 2019. Tom and his wife Lindy live in Oregon with one of their daughters and 2 of their 12 grandchildren. Please help me welcome Mr. Thomas Norman DeWolf. Tom, thank you for being here.
Well, you're welcome, Bill, and I'm just honored that you've asked me to join you today, and all of your listeners. Thanks.
Yeah. So I wanted to sort of start this story, your journey into enlightenment, if you will, as it relates to your racial awareness. And I think the best place for us to start is perhaps at the beginning, when your cousin, Katrina Brown, reached out and sent a sort of a mass mailing to cousins both near and far. Could you start that story and sort of lead us into that journey?
Yeah. Actually, I did not know Katrina, but where I live in Oregon, I had a restaurant, and it was in downtown near the fire hall, and we had lots of good customers who were firemen and firewomen. And one of these people that worked for the fire department came up to me one day, and he said, "I think we might be related." It would help if I wouldn't drop my phone, right? He said, "I think we might be related. My father's middle name is DeWolf." And I said, "Well, could be." And he said, "Yeah, he's got this book." And I said, "The DeWolf book?" I said, "I've only heard about it. I've never actually seen one. It's a genealogy book that was written, I think it was published in 1905, something like that." And anyway, we ended up, my wife and I, on our honeymoon, part of it went and visited Dave's father, and he figured out that we were sixth cousins once removed, Dave and I. And so that was 1986, and his dad told me all these stories about the family that I had never heard before, because it's a different branch of the family, but he's telling me how we're related to, Herman Melville, who wrote Moby Dick. His aunt was married to a DeWolf, and, he refers to Captain John DeWolf in the book Moby Dick, and being related to, the guy who played Paul Drake on the Perry Mason TV show was a DeWolf, and the guy who made that poem famous, Casey at the Bat, there is no joy in much though mighty Casey has struck out. That he performed this like 10,000 times. He's a DeWolf. And Drew Barrymore, her great aunt Ethel, was married to the DeWolfs and lived in the mansion in Bristol, Rhode Island, family mansion, for many years. And so that was my connection to this family. It's like, I'm related to Drew Barrymore.
Right.
And he mentioned the fact that there were slave traders, rum runners, and privateers in the family. But what I sort of had a vision of was, I guess, sort of like the Pirates of the Caribbean ride at Disneyland. Yo-ho, these scoundrels, these pirates. But it didn't really make a connection to me with really the legacy of slavery and the seriousness of our nation's history. And so that was 86. And then fast forward to the year 2000, Dave's the one who got invited, along with 200 other family members that Katrina had reached out to, using information from David's father about who's all related in this far-flung family. But I'm not in that list. I'm just too far away. And Dave's the one who gave me the invitation and said, "You should contact this lady. You like movies. She's making a movie about the family." And so I did, and ultimately was invited to participate, one of 10 people. And some of there was like two siblings, and there were first and second cousins, and I was the furthest away. I was like seventh cousin from everybody else who participated. But that was my introduction and participating in this journey of retracing the triangle slave trade, that this family for 50 years, from the 1769 until 1820, over 100 voyages from Rhode Island to West Africa, primarily Ghana, and then bringing African people to the Caribbean, North and South America. And they had 5 sugar and coffee plantations in Cuba. So we visited Cuba as well as Ghana, and being in slave dungeons, being in places where there were former what they call plantations, which are slave labor camps, and retracing that route, but also grappling with the history at every step along the way. And so meeting with historians, meeting with African American people, meeting with Ghanaian people, with Cuban people, and grappling with the legacy of slavery. And so that was really the introduction to me, was in 2000, 2001, because this was not information that was known at all in my family. Nothing. I'd never heard of any sort of connection like this.
Wow.
Growing up, yeah.
Wow. So on that journey, so you mentioned that you guys, so talk to me about Rhode Island and its significance in this story as the sort of hub.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I have done many times is ask people, if you could name the largest slave trading state in the country, what would it be? People are like, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and nobody guesses Rhode Island. But Rhode Island was responsible for literally half of all the transatlantic slave trading that was done from this country. I mean, it's a small, rocky state. And so the real industry in Rhode Island was shipping, and it was whaling, and it was slave trading. And so with the slave trade, literally half of, and the United States, racism, slavery, the foundation of our nation, and still this country was only responsible for like 3 or 4% of the worldwide slave trade. We were a pretty small player, but what the United States did was sort of blend capitalism with racism in the creation of a system of racial hierarchy that puts white people at the top and people of African descent at the bottom, and so it was the creation of that system of hierarchy that values people who look like me over people who look like you, Bill. And it's been that way from the very, very beginning. And so getting that awareness, it's been something that, and Rhode Island, has a long history, like all of the original 13 colonies, 13 states, a long history of racism that impact Native peoples, indigenous peoples, as well as African people, and all of the horrible abuse of Native people in Rhode Island. There's a long history of that as well, and Rhode Island has honestly just begun in the past decade or two, really grappling with their own history and dealing with it. And Traces of the Trade had a fair lot to do with that in Bristol. Where,
just outing that whole history and so you can't deny it any further.
Well, sure, and Linden Place, this house, this mansion, that's it's in public hands. It's a museum now, but was in the family since it was first built in, I want to say 1810. And it was built all from the proceeds of the slave trade. All from profits from the slave trade. And it wasn't until just a few years ago that they began really openly acknowledging that and giving tours through Bristol, connected to the slave trade. And, the DeWolf Tavern down at the water's edge that was all part of slavery. Now it's a restaurant. But that was the offices for the slave traders back in the day. So it's now, even though there's still a long way to go in really being open and clear about the history, it's happening some. It's more in the curriculum now. And I think that's one of the big challenges for me. How is it that I don't know my own family history, but I don't know my nation's history. I don't know, it's just not taught. What's taught is the Civil War. The South is bad. The North is straightened out those horrible racists in the South and won the Civil War. And then, Brown versus Board of Education and Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act. But good God, look where we are today with the current Republican administration and all the dog whistle racism that exists. It's like our education system has let us down.
Wow.
And, I think that's a big part of what we as a nation need to grapple with is honestly dealing with our history and the impact that it has today.
Yeah. So Tom, when you discovered this, all of these truths about racism and the slave trade, and that being largely in the East Coast and dominant in the East Coast, because there are certain things that we do know and we acknowledge, but I don't think we put two and two together, which is, we acknowledge that slaves built the White House, but it's like, what do we think, that they were just sort of, caravanned up from Mississippi cotton field, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
In order to arrive there just to be builders?
When I'm reading that in 1745, when you look at the census in the state of Connecticut, half of the ministers, Christian ministers in that state, owned African people. And, it's like, how can you be an itinerant preacher going out and preaching the gospel and saving souls unless you've got somebody to take care of your house? And so you own enslaved people. And there's, the periods of time where in Rhode Island, something like 15% of the population was black and enslaved. And that's, part of the history that is becoming more known now. But who knew? I never knew that virtually all 13 colonies at all 13 states, slavery was legal and practiced and built the economy. It allowed this country to rapidly become a world power because you got free labor to build everything. That,
right.
From people that you stole from another land. Yeah.
Wow. And it's important to note that, as we refer to the real status of people, that this was viewed as property. So there wasn't a human quality placed on that, which is the very founding of our nation, in fact, as the Constitution reflects. That's tough stuff. I find it very interesting. One of the most fascinating pieces that you have mentioned was, again, the dominance and the effect of and the role that slavery played in the East Coast. And there does seem to be a tremendous denial and the ease of being able to blame it on those folks in the South. It's backward folks in the South or whatever, which is completely false. It's a tremendous deflection, So,
Well,
that's crazy.
No question. And a lot of people will talk about the well-intentioned, good-hearted, liberal, progressive people in the North. And the reality is that you had all the sundown towns in the North where black people could be during the day because we need you to work, but you're not allowed to be here at night. You got to get out of town and stay somewhere else. Places like the state where I live in Oregon, where when the Constitution was passed, it was passed with a provision that we're going to be a free state, not a slave state, but at the same time, no black people are allowed to live here. That was written into the Constitution.
Wow.
And it was in the Constitution until the 1920s. And so the reality of that is we're here now in the year 2020, and I live in one of the whitest states in the nation as a result. And there's some Oregon news going on also at this point. But we're gonna take a little pause right now. You're listening to Bill Myers Inspires with my guest, Mr. Thomas Norman DeWolf. We'll be back in just a minute.
Are you a subject matter expert? Are you here to share your expertise with an audience waiting to hear from you in only the way you can deliver? Are you ready to have your voice amplified across the airwaves? Inspired Choices Network has a global radio platform, streaming to millions of people across the world. Professionally produced and supported by an accomplished team every step of the way, you can broadcast from anywhere in the world, knowing your voice matters, and we ensure it is delivered with ease and efficiency. Eager to hear your message, the world awaits. Contact us today to become an Inspired Choices Network radio host. Email becomeahost@inspiredchoicesnetwork.com.
You're listening to Bill Myers Inspires here on the Inspired Choices Network. We're here every Friday at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Thank you for joining us. And now, let's get back to the conversation.
Welcome back. Our guest today is author and tremendous human being, Brother Thomas Norman DeWolf. We are talking about the impact of racism and slavery in this nation, and you just brought up something just a moment ago, speaking of Oregon, which is where you are from, in Bend, Oregon. Tell us about the what's going on in Oregon right now. And what is your thought about that?
It's gosh. Well, I mean, Oregon right now is being occupied in a certain sense by federal troops ordered by the Republican administration to supposedly protect the federal building in Portland. And so, as you know, anybody who's following the news knows that you've got these federal troops without name tags, without charging people, without giving any reason, are just pulling people off the street, putting them into a vehicle, and taking them away. And my understanding is, I don't know that they're being arrested. I don't know that they're being charged. I'm reading more and more stories now that are coming out from people who have been victims of this abuse. But it's, you know, here I live in this incredibly white state. I mean, my town is 94% people of European descent. I think the state is 90%-ish. So you've got a whole lot of white people marching for Black Lives Matter in the state of Oregon, and signs up all over my little town and in towns that I just never would have imagined before. It's like that there's one silver lining to racial awareness over the past few years. It's the fact that we've got a president and a significant number of his enablers and supporters in Congress who are being overtly and openly racist, using, you know, the kind of dog whistle language around Confederate statues, around states' rights, around, you know, you name it. That the silver lining is a whole lot of people of European descent are waking up and recognizing that the Black Lives Matter movement is critical to the transformation of our nation into a more just and equitable place. And, you know, you've got a Republican administration, and I use those words specifically because it's not just the one guy at the top. He's got all of his supporters as well. So this Republican administration appears to be targeting locations that he will unlikely carry in the election in November. So he's proving he's a tough guy by going after places that are run primarily by Democrat voters and Democratic elected officials. And Portland happened to be the first place that he sent in these thugs, literally, to try and show that he's a tough guy, a law and order administration. It honestly, it feels like an act of desperation, and if it wasn't so deadly serious, it would be funny. And there are a lot of political cartoons coming out about it, but it's an eerie time to be where I live right now. And it Bill, what it strikes me is that we're in this place right now that's become like a perfect storm. It feels like there's three aspects to this. And one is this particular Republican administration and their tactics and the words that they use, the actions that they take. But in addition to that, you had the death of George Floyd, which felt like a real tipping point. I mean, there have been a lot of people who have been murdered by police, a lot of black people who have been murdered by police. But there was something about George Floyd's murder that pushed everything, turned the volume up dramatically in ways that have really caught a lot of attention. And so the Black Lives Matter movement has really caught on in a lot of places that it hadn't prior to. The third piece of this, which I think is equally important, is this coronavirus pandemic, because what that resulted in is this huge unemployment, a whole lot of people at home, a whole lot of people being able to watch more news, pay closer attention to what's going on in the world, and to have the time to protest, to have the time to do this work, to read books, to watch movies, to learn more about the legacy of slavery. And it's happening. We've had, with Coming to the Table, the organization that I've worked for since 2013 is, and I've been involved with it since the beginning, since 2006, we've added something like 700 new members in the last 45 days.
Congratulations. That's awesome.
Well, it is, and it's largely, not all, but largely white folks saying, essentially sort of a common theme is, I didn't realize how bad it was. And there's, I understand people saying, well, how can people be so ignorant? And what I would say is, first of all, those three things, the pandemic, the Black Lives Matter movement, and this Republican administration, those three things combined have created this perfect storm where you would end up having hundreds of new people interested in coming to the table. And I'm sure the same thing is happening with SURGE, with NAACP, with so many organizations doing anti-racism, anti-oppression work, that there's a lot more interest in it now. But how can people be so ignorant that we wouldn't know? And I will tell you, that's how the system works. It's for people like me to remain ignorant, because that's what props up the system. When I don't know, then I can't deal with these issues. And it's not, like I'm overtly taught, but that's how the system works. To keep things hidden from me that would question my worldview. Does that make sense?
It absolutely makes sense, and I'm immediately reminded once again of the quote that I started the show with, which I believe that perfect storm notion, and I want to repeat that one more time. James Baldwin says, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. So what you were talking about as far as the pandemic, keeping people at home, the dog whistles that are sort of outing all of the racist tendencies and cultures sort of bubbling up, coupled with Black Lives Matter. Again, we are forced to look at it right now. People have the opportunity and not much else to do with a pandemic looming. They are looking at this, and it is causing, I believe, personal inquiry.
Yeah. Personal
inquiry. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the thing that strikes me is that once people, I remember when I came home from the journey that became my first book, Inheriting the Trade, and the film, Traces of the Trade. And shortly after returning home, my parents were celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary, and they had a big party in Southern California. Well, there's a whole lot going on then like there is now. Then we get home from this journey, and 8 days later is September 11th of 2001. And so, in fact, on September 11th was the date that editing was supposed to begin in New York City for Traces of the Trade. And obviously that got shut down and money dried up, and so it took a lot longer to complete the film. And so the film and the book both came out in January of 2008. So, 7 long years. But when I first got back, September 11th, and then 2 months later is my parents' 50th wedding anniversary. And I'm down in Southern California, and I'm talking with the only black man in the church that I grew up in, Mr. Bailey. And I told him, I said, can I talk to you? I said, I learned all this history I never learned in school here in Pomona in Southern California, where I grew up, where I've known him all my life. And I said, it just absolutely stunned me. And he looked at me and he said, Tom, we've always known that truth. That's always taught in our schools. And he said, one thing your mother was always disappointed is that you decided not to be a minister after going to college to study to be a minister, that you didn't, because she was really looking forward to being a minister's mother. And she said, and he said, now look how God works. He says, now you're going to be a minister after all, because once you know the truth, you're responsible for that truth. And now you're going to minister to people with this truth about our nation's history. And I have never forgotten that. I mean, we jumped into each other's arms, and, the tears on our cheeks. It was just a really powerful moment, but that responsibility for the truth. So as someone finds out, their ancestors owned people, or they just simply learn about our nation's history and feel a personal responsibility, which I think is what's really important. Because I've had people tell me, I'm glad I'm not you. I'm glad I'm not related to people like that. And it's like, do you suppose you're related to people that wore cotton clothing, that drank tea or coffee or used sugar, tobacco, indigo, ate rice? The entire economic engine of the entire world was based in slavery. That was the fuel. So there's nobody that isn't connected to this history. And so if you look at your family's history and you've lived in this country long enough, you'll find a connection to enslavement. But don't bother. You've still got an obligation and a responsibility and a connection and the privilege of having white skin. And so part of the work is getting past those feelings of guilt and shame, getting past those feelings of fragility, and getting to a space of doing the work, which is where, for me anyway, coming home from this big journey, it's like, oh my God, this is horrible. What's next? And that's really the question people need to ask of themselves, is what's next? What can I do next that can make a positive difference, that can help create the beautiful world we all know is possible? What can I do? And that's where I think coming to the table and the coming to the table approach can be really helpful to people. That offers a pathway, offers an approach to racial healing that is workable, that is doable, that is done in community, that there's a lot of support for.
It has to be done together. There has to be a coming together. We must make connection in order to do that. You know what I mean? And have frank and open heartfelt dialogue in order to get there.
I think so.
Honesty.
I mean, there's a lot of people who will say, well, Bill, talking is just talk. We need to take action. And the thing about the coming to the table approach is it acknowledges all of that. It's sort of this both and approach, because it's grounded in theories and practices that have been studied and tested, things like strategies for trauma awareness and resilience to trauma, both historic and present-day trauma, and that if we don't deal with the trauma and heal ourselves from trauma, whether it's historic or present-day, we pass it on to our kids. It's grounded in restorative justice principles. It's grounded in conflict transformation, in spirituality. And the approach itself has 4 pillars. And the first is understanding, acknowledging, studying all of history, so that we're working from a place of common knowledge about the legacy of slavery in our nation's history. The second pillar is, like we just spoke about, relationships, building connections, authentic and accountable relationships, both within and across racial lines, for the purpose of working together and doing so with people that we know and trust. The third pillar is healing by any means necessary. Perhaps it's in your faith community through prayer or meditation. It's apology. It's reparation. It's music. It's yoga. It's dance. It's self-care. Whatever means we can use to heal these racial wounds, we do that together. And then the fourth pillar is taking action to undo the systems and structures of racial oppression and injustice in our society, in our communities. And so taken together, without any one of those being the priority, but all 4 of them being essential, it creates a new system, a new way of approaching the world that will lead towards racial healing. And that's what, when Jody and I wrote the little book of racial healing, and another, I think another 10 or 11 writers contributed illustrative stories to that book, including Sharon Morgan, my co-author for Gather the Table. But the little book of racial healing pulls together the entire coming to the table approach, along with a whole series of recommended readings for people to learn more about each of the aspects of this approach. And the whole idea behind this is, yes, we're in this together, and we have work to do together. And this is what the work is. It's liberation, it's truth-telling, it's transformation. It's not, I used to use the word reconciliation, and I don't anymore, because it's like, okay, I'm married, and if my wife and I get into a big fight, reconciliation is getting us to a place where we are back at that point of love and trust again. That's reconciling. Well, we've never had a point of love and trust between European Americans and African Americans in this country. That good relationship has never existed. So it's not reconciling unless you use reconciling to getting back to our best selves in sort of this infinite spiritual approach to looking at that word. But really it's transformation. It's creating a new way of looking at life, a new way of living together in terms of justice and what have you.
And it's recognizing the divinity and as well as the humanity in each one of us. And being able to see that. I always love namaste, the idea of I see the God in you. That is such a very powerful way to greet another individual. That has always struck me as very powerful. We are going to take a brief pause. We thank you for joining us today, and stay tuned while we continue our discussion with Thomas Norman DeWolf. Thank you so much.
Are you a subject matter expert? Are you here to share your expertise with an audience waiting to hear from you in only the way you can deliver? Are you ready to have your voice amplified across the airwaves? Inspired Choices Network has a global radio platform streaming to millions of people across the world. Professionally produced and supported by an accomplished team every step of the way, you can broadcast from anywhere in the world, knowing your voice matters, and we ensure it is delivered with ease and efficiency. Eager to hear your message, the world awaits. Contact us today to become an Inspired Choices Network radio host. Email becomeahost@inspiredchoicesnetwork.com.
You're listening to Bill Myers Inspires here on the Inspired Choices Network. We're here every Friday at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Thank you for joining us. And now, let's get back to the conversation.
We're back with our special guest today, Thomas Norman DeWolf, and we are in the midst of, here at Bill Myers Inspires, a series of discussions regarding the tough topic and tough discussion of race. And I am pleased to have had our first guest last week, who was Dixon D. White. Today we have Thomas Norman DeWolf. Next week we have his co-author, Sharon Morgan, who will be illuminating us with information regarding her ministry, her work, which deals with our Black ancestry. You can imagine that that's quite a challenge, particularly when we see so many people who enjoy learning about their history and their lineage, and they go, rejoice in Ancestry.com. Just imagine if you are a Black person in this nation where you can only go back so far before you may hit a wall. So Sharon Morgan has been kicking down the doors and doing the deep work to try to reconnect that history of Black people and their African ancestry. So we applaud her, and we will have her here with us next week. And then the following week, we will have Thomas Norman DeWolf and Sharon Leslie Morgan together discussing their book, Gather at the Table. So please stick with us for this important series. And it is such a blessing to have Thomas with us now. And, Tom, you were just talking about your work with the coming to the table. And I just want to make sure that I think it's, and as we had talked about before, I think it's so very important that we are able to connect people who are curious, who do have questions, who are open and do know that there's something to this Black Lives Matter movement, and are prepared to sort of inquire, look around for resources that they can engage in. And I just want to explore that as we continue, because we're looking for solutions and positive ways that people can make a difference and find the information and find community that they can connect to in a safe way that allows them to discover a little bit more about themselves. So if you would take us down that path a little bit. Yeah,
Sure. Coming to the table, anybody can access the website, comingtothetable.org, comingtothetable.org. And there's just a wealth of resources there, that people can understand the focus of Coming to the Table, really, the vision that Coming to the Table has for the United States is of a just and truthful society that acknowledges and seeks to heal from the racial wounds of the past, from slavery and the many forms of racism it spawned. And so what Coming to the Table does is provide leadership and resources and a supportive environment for everybody who wants to do this work. And, with a focus on healing the wounds from racism. And so, having this whole approach with the 4 pillars that we discussed earlier, a particular set of values that highlights the importance of inclusion, respect and tolerance, honesty, truthfulness, transparency, compassion, love, peace, nonviolence. There's all of this information is available on the website. There's just a wealth of resources regarding genealogy, mindfulness, reparations, and just a whole wealth of information, books, films, stories by various members and other useful resources, articles, recommended films and books and what have you. So, and then, people can become members, which, as much as we appreciate financial support, you can join for free. And yes, you will be asked to contribute so that we can keep up with all this tremendous growth, but it's not a requirement to become a member. And once you're a member, you get the monthly newsletter that just shares all the local group meetings that are taking place. There's 42 local groups currently in 16 different states. And,
wow.
And we've got close to 5,000 subscribers to the monthly newsletter. We've got a monthly learning series going on right now, the next of which is focuses on family history that Sharon is part of, actually, and that's 2 days from now on July 26th, Sunday. And that recording will be available soon after that people can watch. But we've had this monthly series where we've had a couple hundred people signing up for each one.
So is that going to be accessed on the website, on the comingtothetable.org, on the website itself?
People can sign up for it there. And,
okay.
And so it's, on the events calendar, they'll see this Sunday, and they can certainly sign up for it there.
Okay.
Or watch it after, either way. And we've got a monthly guided meditation program. There's so many resources available for people, whether they're writers, whether they're looking for their own family history, wanting to connect with people that they're connected to through the legacy of slavery, whether they're writers interested in writing for the Bittersweet blog. It's just become an amazing network with Coming to the Table, both online and in person. Although right now, you mentioned at the beginning, a lot of the public speaking that I do, the pandemic has brought so much of our lives to a screeching halt, or a screeching difference, I guess. And most everything with Coming to the Table is being done online right now.
Okay.
But we're not slowing down.
Oh, no, this is the time. This is the time. And discussions like this and platforms like this are the ways in which we can get that out. And I'm certainly proud to assist in any way possible. And I'll be signing up my membership here in just a minute as soon as we get off this show.
Very much appreciated, Bill. It's always so good to work with you.
Yeah. So I want to just take a moment and just sort of share our story. As you mentioned creativity, and you mentioned compassion, connection, and I just wanted to share how Tom and I came to meet one another. And it was, I was president of the African American Jazz Caucus in 2012, and we had an annual big event where we honored different jazz legends. And one day it occurred to me that we were only addressing jazz as a music art form, and I wanted to include our definition of jazz as a culture, and how that culture was the predecessor to the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King spoke so eloquently about that in a 1964 Berlin Jazz Festival speech, when he cited jazz musicians as the forerunners of the civil rights movement, because these were the exceptions that could come in and play the music. These were the exceptions that could come in and interact and play with white musicians. there was this wonderful drama that was occurring. It was the jazz age that ushered in women exploring their rights when they cut their hair short and wore flapper dresses. This was all during the jazz age. And so we must acknowledge that women were coming out and just exploring and self-expression of themselves, just as the musicians were. So it was a very powerful time. And so I wanted to implement an award that honored the other jazz musicians, the non-musicians, who were also in the good fight as it relates to social justice and working towards civil rights. And this is how I came to acknowledge Tom DeWolf and his work with inheriting the trade and that sort of thing. So, Tom, it was a great pleasure to award you with that, along with the great African-American author Mari Evans for her work in literature. It was just a tremendous thing, and so I just want to acknowledge that was one of the finest moments for me, was to be able to acknowledge your work on slavery and racism and your ministry as it is in this country. And again, I thank you for your work there, sir.
Well, I not only appreciate your kind words, Bill, but was just really humbled to be included in that amazing company when that award was made. And, you remind me of what a small world this is when we pay attention. And I think you'll remember this story. I used to have a club here in Central Oregon that was a part restaurant, part movie theater, that we also did live music and live comedy. And I was telling you one time about when Ray Brown played as part of the LA4 that played at our club. And Ray Brown is like, one of the most famous jazz bassists in history. And my
he
dad
wrote the book
was
on
a
it.
huge Ray Brown fan, and I remember when he was playing, I just held my phone up into the music room so that my dad could hear Ray Brown playing. And then you told me the story about when Ray Brown passed away right there in your town of Indianapolis, and that the last bass that he played was your bass.
Yeah, it was my amplifier. That's right. He used it every time he came into town, and that was the final moment of Ray Brown. And what a tremendous.
And it was that extra little bit of connection between you and me that I have always really appreciated, the fact that we have this connection through, yes, the African American Jazz Caucus, but jazz music itself and Ray Brown specifically.
Yeah, that is so awesome.
Because music and jazz in particular, oh my gosh, talk about something that breaks down. I mean, we talked about Jackie Robinson breaking down the color barrier in baseball, with the support of Branch Rickey and the Dodgers. Well, you look at jazz music, that's the place, man, where people were breaking down barriers of race, because if you can play music, you belong.
Absolutely, and risking their lives at the same time. Many times risking their lives when they toured through the South and the racist South and that sort of thing. Tom, it has been a pleasure, and we will continue this conversation here in a couple of weeks. Next week, we're going to have your partner out here, Sharon Morgan, telling us about her work with our Black ancestry. It's been a pleasure to have you with us today here on Bill Myers Inspires. And we are so happy to be here on the Inspired Choices Network, here every Friday, 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Again, I am so honored and thank Mr. Thomas Norman DeWolf for being with us today. And so we hope that you'll tune in for the rest of our series as we continue our deep dive into racism in America. So once again, I'm your host, Bill Myers, and you've been listening to Bill Myers Inspires. Thank you for tuning in. And we'll hear you here. We'll see you here next week, same time, Friday, 3 p.m. Thank you so much.
Thank you for spending your afternoon right here with us at Bill Myers Inspires. Remember, we're here every Friday at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on the Inspired Choices Network. Remember to take time this week to take a breath and look within yourself and figure out how you can make a positive difference in this world. Spread the word, and we'll see you here next Friday.